Joe Cocker stood at the microphone and had not yet sung a note, and the musicians in the room were already paying attention in the specific way that musicians pay attention when something is about to happen that they cannot predict. Tom Jones had been watching from the other side of the stage. He had been watching Joe Cocker since the moment he walked in, watching with the quality of attention that recognized something. Tom Jones was not, as a general rule, a person who was easily impressed by the arrival of other performers. He had shared stages with a great many people at this point. He had watched a great many versions of impressive arrive through studio doors. But there was a specific quality to the attention he was paying to Joe Cocker that the people who knew Tom Jones well would have recognized as the attention he reserved for things that genuinely interested him, rather than things that merely confirmed what he already knew. He was watching something he had not encountered before, which was not a voice similar to his own, but a voice that had arrived at a similar place by an entirely different route. Not the recognition of familiarity, the recognition of a specific kind of kinship that performers sometimes encounter in each other, and that is not social or personal, but purely musical. The recognition of someone who has the same problem you have, which is too much voice and not enough room to put it. They had not performed together before. They had been aware of each other. The late 1960s were a compressed world in that specific sense, the circle of people making the music that was redefining what popular music could be was smaller than the scale of its influence suggested. And within that circle, the names and reputations were known even before the meetings happened. Tom Jones knew who Joe Cocker was. Joe Cocker knew who Tom Jones was. Both of them knew, in the imprecise way that one knows things about people before meeting them, that the other operated at a similar intensity level. What neither of them had known, until the cameras were running and the band began to play, was what that meant when both intensities were occupying the same room at the same time. The This Is Tom Jones program had been built around exactly this kind of encounter. It had been built in the specific way that Tom Jones had conceived it when it launched in 1969, around the premise that the most interesting thing a television music program could do was not to present music that had already been fully completed and polished and made safe for broadcast, but to create situations in which music happened in front of the cameras in ways that could not have been fully anticipated. The producers had their schedules and their formats and their running times, and Tom Jones had his conviction that what audiences remembered, what they carried with them after the broadcast ended and the televisions went dark, was not the smooth 45 minutes, but the unplanned 30 seconds in the middle of it. He had been building toward these unplanned 30 seconds systematically by booking the kinds of performers who were capable of producing them. It had been built around the question of what happened when you put two performers with incompatible intensities in the same room and pointed cameras at them and let the music decide. Most of the time, the music decided well. Occasionally, the music decided extraordinarily. The day Joe Cocker walked into the studio was the second kind of day. When they sang together, and they did sing together, because the format of the show required it, and because both of them were professionals who could operate within a format while simultaneously exceeding it, what emerged was something that the production team would describe afterward, in the particular way that production teams describe things they did not fully anticipate, as a little more than we were expecting. This was an understatement in the precise technical sense, a deliberate reduction of a large thing to a smaller description. What had happened was not complicated to describe, though it was complicated to explain. What had happened was two voices that had each developed in isolation from the other, had each worked out, independently, how to take a large amount of raw material and shape it into something that a room could receive, and that had discovered, when placed together, that their solutions were compatible in ways that neither of them could have predicted from the separate experiences of working out the solutions. Tom Jones's voice had the quality of a controlled power, the Welsh choral tradition underneath it, the Las Vegas training on top of it, a voice that knew how to project into a large room without losing intimacy. Joe Cocker's voice had the quality of an effortful rawness, Sheffield working class underneath it, the blues tradition at its center, a voice that made the effort visible as part of the experience rather than concealing it as a flaw. These were different solutions to different problems, arrived at by different people in different places using different raw materials, and they fit together in a way that you could not have anticipated from examining the solutions separately. They fit together the way certain harmonies fit together, not because they were similar, but because the distance between them was exactly the right distance. The distance that creates something in the space between the two things that neither of the two things contains on its own. Tom Jones heard it. Joe Cocker heard it. The musicians in the band heard it and adjusted accordingly, which is what musicians do when something unusual is happening, and they are skilled enough to recognize it and respond to it in real time. The studio audience heard it with less technical understanding, but with the same essential accuracy. They heard that the room had become something different from what it had been before the two voices were placed in it together. The cameras recorded it. The show aired. The moment passed into the archive of things that existed and were significant, and would take time for the culture to fully understand what had happened in them. Joe Cocker, in 1969, was 25 years old and was in the specific position of someone who had just been recognized by the largest possible audience in the most unmistakable possible terms, and who was not certain, yet, how to carry that recognition while continuing to do the thing that had produced it. The risk of recognition of that magnitude, the Woodstock recognition, the recognition that makes a name known to people who have not been following the music, is that it can change the calculation. It can make a person begin making decisions based on the recognition rather than based on the music that produced it. Joe Cocker had not, by 1969, made that shift. He was still making decisions based on the music. He had released, with a little help from my friends, the previous year, his version of the Beatles song that had taken the gentle optimism of the original and replaced it with something that sounded as though the question of whether you would survive was genuinely unresolved. He had performed at Woodstock, which was the defining moment of that particular summer, and had performed it in the specific way that Woodstock performances were either adequate to the occasion or were not, completely. He had held nothing back, and the festival had received everything he offered and returned something in kind. And Joe Cocker had come out of that summer as one of the voices that the era had decided mattered. His voice was difficult to describe without resorting to physical metaphors. Most descriptions tried, and most of them landed in the same general territory. Gravelly, raw, emotional, gospel-inflected, blues-soaked. And all of them were accurate as far as they went, and none of them went far enough. Because the thing that made Joe Cocker's voice what it was could not be fully recovered from a description of its qualities in the abstract. The qualities were real, but they were in service of something that the qualities alone did not explain. What they were in service of was a complete commitment to the emotional reality of whatever song he was singing. Not the performance of emotion, not the technical reproduction of the emotional register that the song lived in, but the actual thing, the actual emotion, pursued as though the song required it to be real in order to exist at all. It was rough in the specific way that rough things are rough when they have been shaped by friction rather than abrasion. Not broken, not damaged, but formed by resistance, by the specific quality of a voice that had been pushed through difficult material for years and had come out with its character intensified rather than diminished. He sang with his whole body, which was not unusual among performers of that era, but he sang with his whole body in a way that made it evident that the body was not decorative. The body was part of the instrument, the visible portion of an effort that was happening simultaneously in multiple places at once. Tom Jones had watched this entering the room. He had watched it the way you watch something you recognize from the inside rather than from the outside, from the position of someone who understood what the effort looked like because he had been making the same effort, in a different register, in a different accent, for 15 years. Tom Jones continued performing for 50 years. Joe Cocker continued performing for 45. They would cross paths again in the years that followed. The world of popular music is smaller than it appears from the outside, and the people who are operating at that level of intensity tend to find each other, tend to be in the same rooms and on the same stages and at the same festivals, because the world gravitates toward its own intensity. They knew each other. They respected each other with the specific quality of respect that exists between people who have understood from the inside what the other person is doing. Joe Cocker died in 2014. Tom Jones, speaking of him afterward, did not reach for the superlatives that obituaries reach for. He spoke about what it had been like to be in the room with him, about the specific quality of the experience of hearing that voice from a distance of a few feet, which was different from hearing it recorded, which was different from hearing it from a theater seat. Up close, the commitment was visible in a way that recordings could not fully capture. Up close, you understood that the voice was the whole person, that Joe Cocker had not found a way to separate the singing from the living. They were the same thing, operating simultaneously, and the room received them as one. Both of them went on to the rooms and the concerts and the recordings and all the work that a long career is made of. But the specific thing that had happened in an ABC television studio in Los Angeles, the thing that emerged in the space between two voices that had each figured out, separately, how to do the thing they did, that was unrepeatable in the way that all genuine collisions are unrepeatable. It had required both of them in the same room, on the same day, with the same music and the same microphones and the same cameras and the same band. And it had required neither of them to know in advance what was going to happen, because the not knowing was part of what had made it what it was. Joe Cocker had stood at the microphone before the song began and had not yet sung a note, and the musicians had been paying attention in the way that musicians pay attention when they can hear something coming that they cannot describe. They had been right to pay attention. The thing coming had been the specific encounter of two voices that had each solved the hardest problem a voice faces: how to be real in front of an audience. And that had discovered, when placed together, that real things are compatible in ways that manufactured things are not. They had been right to pay attention. The room was about to become something different from what it currently was, and the musicians, skilled enough to hear it coming, had prepared themselves for what the music was going to require of them. The music required everything. Both voices gave it. The room held what they gave it and gave it back. That was the whole of it, and it was entirely enough. Some things do not need to be larger than they are. Some things are sufficient in exactly the form they arrive in. The collision of those two voices on that day in that room was one of those things. It had been sufficient then, and it remained sufficient in whatever form the archive preserved it. Not because the archive preserved it perfectly, but because what had happened in the room was large enough to survive imperfect preservation, because what had been real did not require ideal conditions to remain recognizable as real.